Okay, next, the appendicular skeletal muscles, muscles that move the arm or act on the glenohumeral joint. Now, you can see that there are multiple muscles that act on the glenohumeral joint. First, there are deep rotator cuff or sits muscles. There are 4 of them. They are shown here in green on your list. Then there are multiple muscles that are superficial to those muscles. And there's the list here underneath in black of all those muscles. So there are 9 muscles that move the arm as their primary action and 2 that move the arm as their secondary action. They all act on the glenohumeral joint. This joint, also called the shoulder joint, has an excellent range of motion, the best in the body, but has low stability and is vulnerable to frequent injuries. And here's your list of muscles that have a primary action that are deep. These are called the rotator cuff or sits muscles, the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis, and muscles that have their primary action, the deltoid, the pectoralis major, the coracobrachialis, the latissimus dorsi, and the teres minor. And finally, the 2 muscles that act on the glenohumeral joint as their secondary action, the bicep brachii, both heads, the long head and the short head, and the tricep brachii, only the long head, not the medial and lateral heads, only the long head. So first, muscles that move the arm or act on the glenohumeral joint, the rotator cuff or sits muscles. So the rotator cuff is composed of a joint capsule around the glenohumeral joint and the tendons of the 4 rotator cuff muscles. The rotator cuff gives the glenohumeral joint support and strength, and yet still the shoulder joint is often injured. The rotator cuff or sits muscles are listed here, and they're called the sits muscles because somebody put them in a certain order that spelled out the word or the acronym SITS. And they're always taught this way, and I recommend that you learn them this way. The supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, the teres minor, going from superior to inferior on the posterior surface of the scapula, and then hidden underneath on the anterior surface of the scapula, the subscapularis, and it spells out SITS. All of the rotator cuff muscles originate on the scapula, and all 4 insert on the humerus. So the supraspinatus, a fossa, just a kind of like, a flat spot where the muscle originates. Then the insertion of the humerus, the greater tubercle, which we learned when we learned bones. The action is abduction of the glenohumeral joint. So that supraspinatus muscle is found inserting kind of superiorly on the humerus, on the greater tubercle, but on the very top, so that when the muscle contracts, it abducts the glenohumeral joint or lifts the arm away from the body in abduction, like you're flapping your arms and you take your arms away from the body. The infraspinatus is found in the infraspinous fossa. That's the origin. And then it inserts on the humerus, also on the greater tubercle, but the insertion is now lower down, a little inferior to the insertion of the supraspinatus. And that location means that the action of the infraspinatus is lateral rotation of the glenohumeral joint, because the placement of the muscle puts it in a good spot for rotating the arm laterally or away from the midline. The teres minor, the origin is the scapula, the lateral border. The insertion is the humerus, the greater tubercle again. And the action is the lateral rotation and adduction of the glenohumeral joint. And so now this insertion is inferior to the supraspinatus and the infraspinatus. So now the action is not only lateral rotation, but the teres minor is in a good position to also adduct the humerus, if it's been abducted, to pull it back towards the midline because of its location. The subscapularis, the origin is on the scapula in the subscapular fossa. That just means the big flat surface under the scapula. The insertion is the humerus, the lesser tubercle, and the action is the medial rotation of the glenohumeral joint. The insertion of this muscle being on the anterior bone means that the muscle is well placed to have the action of medially rotating the glenohumeral joint. This muscle is superficial to the serratus anterior. And if you look at the picture, the insertion of the serratus anterior is shown on the bone. And you can imagine that the serratus anterior is actually deep to the subscapularis. And now, in summary, we have a picture of the four muscles that are in the rotator cuff group, shown here in a posterior view, the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor. And then the next picture is the rotator cuff muscle shown in an anterior view and with a dissection not only of overlying muscles, but even with a cutaway of the rib cage. We're able to see the subscapularis on the anterior surface of the scapula. If you look to the first picture, the bone on the right shows all of the origins in red. So I'm back to slide 43, the posterior view, and it's showing the origin of the supraspinatus and infraspinatus and teres minor, and that's in the posterior view. And then moving to the anterior view, it's showing the origin of the subscapularis. So it can be helpful to look at the little pictures of where muscles insert on the bones. Okay, next, muscles that move the arm or act on the glenohumeral joint. But now we're going to look at the group that is found superficial to or at the periphery of our deep rotator cuff muscles. So 5 muscles have primary actions on the glenohumeral joint and are superficial to or at the periphery of the rotator cuff muscles. They all insert on the humerus. The biceps and triceps brachii have secondary actions on the glenohumeral joint and insert on the radius and the ulna respectively. So they're different, and later on we will learn them in the setting of their primary action on the elbow joint. But right now they're sort of visitors into this group of muscles that act on the glenohumeral joint. So I've broken up these muscles into anterior muscles, the pectoralis major and the coracobrachialis, the bicep brachii with its secondary action, also in this group. Then next, the superior group with the deltoid, and then the posterior group, the latissimus dorsi and the teres major. And sitting in with this team is the tricep brachii, the long head, secondary action of the tricep brachii. Okay, and this picture that follows shows our groupings, the anterior muscles, the superior muscle, and the posterior muscles that act on the glenohumeral joint. And this is the same list. The letters that follow the muscles refer to the picture, which, has letters instead of labels on the muscles. But you can see, okay, the pectoralis major is B. It's shown in the central panel, which is the lateral view. And the rightmost panel, which is the anterior view, and okay, that's my pectoralis major. Then you can pick out the coracobrachialis, almost hidden here in the third picture as E. The bicep brachii is F. The deltoid is like a little cap sleeve on top of the shoulder. That's A. And in our posterior picture, we see the latissimus dorsi, this muscle with a huge origin that goes to a point, C, that's seen in the posterior picture, also seen in the lateral picture. And the teres major just peeping out over the top of the latissimus dorsi. It helps it to perform its actions. Then the tricep brachii, shown here on the posterior arm with the little letter G, and that's this picture. Okay, so the pectoralis major, the origin is the clavicle, sternum, and ribs. So a lot of ground covered by the origin here. If you look at the picture, it's an anterior muscle, and the origin is the clavicle, the sternum, and then the ribs. The insertion is all on the humerus. The action is flexion adduction and medial rotation of the glenohumeral joint. And in addition to the big picture, I have a picture of the bone pointing to the pectoralis major insertion. So knowing that the origin is fixed and that our insertion is on the anterior bone, we can imagine the pectoralis major performing flexion, adduction, and medial rotation of the glenohumeral joint. Okay, next, the coracobrachialis. The origin is the coracoid process of the scapula, and the insertion is the humerus, the medial shaft. The action is adduction and flexion of the glenohumeral joint. And first of all, learning the name. So coraco stands for coracoid process. Brachialis, well, brachii, we know that means arm. So it's saying it's found between the coracoid process and the arm. You can look at its location, its origin, and its insertion, and understand why it performs adduction and flexion. Okay. Then the last anterior muscle, the bicep brachii. The origin of the short head is the scapula, the coracoid process. The origin of the long head is the scapula, the supraglenoid tubercle. The insertion is on the radius at the radial tuberosity, so not on the humerus. So this muscle is crossing two joints. Okay, it's going all the way from the scapula, crossing the glenohumeral joint, and then going down and crossing in front of the elbow joint. So before it inserts on the radius. So this muscle ends up crossing over two joints. Therefore, it can act on both joints because it crosses them. And the contraction can shorten the muscle and have an effect across two joints, not just one. So the primary actions are flexion of the elbow joint and lateral rotation of the radius at the radio-ulnar joint for supination. The secondary action is flexion of the glenohumeral joint. Okay, now those three muscles were in our anterior group. Now let's move on to the superior group, which contains only the deltoid. The origin is on the clavicle and scapula, in particular the acromion and spine of the scapula. The insertion is on the humerus at the deltoid tuberosity. When the whole muscle contracts, the action is abduction of the glenohumeral joint. When the anterior part of the deltoid contracts, the action is flexion of the glenohumeral joint and medial rotation of the humerus. When the posterior part of the muscle contracts, the action is extension and lateral rotation of the glenohumeral joint. Flexion and medial rotation of the glenohumeral joint, and extension and lateral rotation of the glenohumeral joint, just to be consistent there. So this makes sense. It's almost like there's three different little muscles in one. The anterior fibers of the deltoid, which have a more anterior origin and insertion, I suppose. The little fibers can be imagined, although they all insert on one point, can be imagined that the anterior fibers insert a little bit more anteriorly. Then it has a part that has a superior origin, and then it has a part that has an inferior origin. And it can be imagined that these three different parts of the deltoid have different actions. It makes sense based on their location that they perform different actions on the glenohumeral joint. Okay, next muscle in our posterior group is the latissimus dorsi, which has a big origin from the vertebrae T7 to the sacrum, the ribs 8 through 12, and the thoracolumbar fascia, which is a diamond-shaped sheet of fascia in the lower back, which you can see in the picture here. And then the insertion is on the humerus. It's on the intertubercular sulcus. So it actually is found anteriorly on the humerus. Then the actions are extension, adduction, and medial rotation of the glenohumeral joint. Okay. So look at this picture here showing the origins A, B, and C, all along the vertebral column, all the way from T7, all the way down to the sacrum, and then the thoracolumbar fascia down on the lower back, and then coming up lateral border of the muscle, attachments to the ribs, 8 through 12. And then look at how the insertion is found at D in this picture. The whole large muscle has an insertion that sort of tucks under the arm and curls around to the front of the arm so that the actions of the latissimus dorsi are perhaps not what is expected, knowing that it's a posterior muscle, because the insertion is anterior and the actions of extension, adduction, and medial rotation are perhaps a little surprising unless you take note of the fact that the insertion is on the anterior humerus. Okay, the teres major, the origin is the scapula, the inferior angle, which is the point at the bottom of the triangle of the scapula. The insertion is the humerus, the interturbicular sulcus, and the action is extension, adduction, and medial rotation of the glenohumeral joint. Note that the insertion and action is the same as that for the latissimus dorsi. The teres major is called the latissimus dorsi's little helper. Okay, and that helps me to remember that it is quite different than the teres minor, which is in the rotator cuff group. Instead, this is in the posterior group, and it's the latissimus dorsi's little helper. It's similar to the latissimus dorsi. The origin is different, but the insertion and the action are the same. Okay, the tricep brachii is the final member of our posterior group. Remember, it's only the long head that acts on the glenohumeral joint. If we look at the origins in the picture, we see that the origin of the long head is on the scapula, the infraglenoid tubercle, that's a bump below the glenoid cavity. The lateral head inserts on the lateral humerus and the medial, the lateral head originates on the lateral humerus, and the medial head originates on the medial humerus, which is why they're called the lateral and medial heads, okay, because of their insertion on the humerus being lateral and medial. And then all of the heads insert on the ulna, on the olecranon. So the long head crosses two joints, similar to what I said about the bicep brachii. First, it crosses the long head now. First, the long head crosses the glenohumeral joint, and then it crosses the elbow joint. Okay, so crosses two joints. So that means it can have action on two joints, not just one. And if we look, you can see, okay, the action is extension and adduction of the glenohumeral joint. And here's pictures showing muscles that move the arm and act on the glenohumeral joint. And in this anterior picture, we can see the pectoralis major and the coracobrachialis and the bicep brachii. Also, we can see laterally the deltoid. On the side bone pictures, you can see some of the origins and the insertions. On the next picture, which is a posterior view, we see the latissimus dorsi, the teres major, the triceps brachii, and the lateral part of the deltoid, which is our superior muscle. So these might be helpful pictures. Again, look at the little bone picture of the origins and the insertions. And next I have the table for Martini's. So just to reiterate again, something that was taught in the last lecture and that I have been mentioning when explaining the muscles that I just went over in this lecture up to this point, you can use the origin and the insertion of a muscle to predict the action of the muscle. The structure of the joint also helps to predict the action of the muscle. But if we look at the muscles that move the glenohumeral joint, we can think more about this principle. Remember, these muscles originate on the axial skeleton, the clavicle, and/or scapula. So partly on the axial skeleton and partly on the pectoral girdle. All of these muscles have insertions on the humerus, except for the bicep brachii that inserts on the radial tuberosity of the radius, and the tricep brachii that inserts on the olecranon of the ulna. And here's the list. You'll see now that I have mixed together in this list on slide 66 at this point, the rotator cuff muscles and the other muscles that are superficial to it. So now in our anterior group, we have the subscapularis, the pectoralis major, the coracobrachialis, and the bicep brachii. And in the superior group, we have the supraspinatus and the deltoid. In the posterior group, we have the infraspinatus and teres minor, the latissimus dorsi and teres major, and the tricep brachii. So at the glenohumeral joint, we're learning that muscles that have an insertion anterior to the joint may perform flexion and or medial rotation. Muscles that are superior to the joint may perform abduction. Muscles that have an insertion posterior to the joint may perform extension and or lateral rotation. Muscles that have an insertion inferior to the joint may perform adduction. And really, this slide is just saying that the location of the origin and insertion of the muscle is important in understanding why mechanically or physically, in the physics sense, the muscles would have the action that they have. Now, the next 3 slides are really best if you go over yourself. What I've done here is I've taken our list and I've highlighted in red the muscles that have anterior insertions and then said whether they do flexion and or medial rotation. And then the large blow up here of the bone helps you to look at the insertions of these muscles on the humerus and say to yourself, knowing that that's the insertion on the humerus, it makes sense that these muscles would act on the glenohumeral joint to cause flexion and or medial rotation. There's not much point in me reading it out to you, but you can look at it and study on it and be like, that is interesting. All right, now in the next slide, the muscles in red have posterior insertions and perform extension and or lateral rotation. And again, you can look at the pictures of the bones to the right here, and you can say, looking at the insertions, I can understand that these muscles can perform extension and or lateral rotation. So perhaps take a moment and look at the posterior view of the humerus. Note the insertion of the infraspinatus and the teres minor. And this is actually a posterior view of the right humerus. And in the posterior view, you can see the infraspinatus and the teres minor. And then in the anterior view, you can see the insertion of the teres major and the latissimus dorsi. And I have stars by the latissimus dorsi and teres major because we're talking in this slide about muscles that have posterior insertions and explaining how that, lets us predict that they will perform extension and or lateral rotation. But the latissimus dorsi and the teres major actually have anterior insertions. So this is kind of like the exception that proves the rule. Nonetheless, it is a helpful idea to think of the insertions and where they're placed and how that explains or predicts the action. Of course, it still makes sense what the latissimus dorsi and the teres major do, but they just happen to have anterior insertions. The deltoid is more on the lateral side of the humerus. So that's sort of a little bit of an exception too. They could have showed the insertion of the deltoid in the posterior view just a little bit also, but the picture doesn't quite show it. And now talking in this third slide about abduction and adduction, the muscles in red are superior to the joint and perform abduction. Muscles in blue have insertions inferior to the joint and perform adduction. And the pictures of the bones, the anterior view and the posterior view, are helpful in working through the insertions and how they can be used to understand the actions. So just have a look at this slide. All right. Okay, so the appendicular skeletal muscles